It was late afternoon when Helena stood at the gate with her hair tied in a plain knot and an unpaid civic tribute clutched in her hands. A man from the council, trained in dokimasia procedures, put out a hand and ordered her forward as if she were a sack of grain. She was 22. Her mother had wept. Her father had bowed. The injustice was simple and brutal. The elders of Sparta did not execute her. They erased her. The case of Helena is not an outlier. It belongs to an institution that presented itself as guardian of purity and civic strength while it managed property, debts, and the bodies of those it placed under civic dedication. When the community spoke of consecration and service, the official records spoke in colder terms. Lists of dependents, decrees stamped by ephors, ostraca tallied as obligations owed to the magistracy and to the civic rights that governed unmarried women declared available for service. The image most accept of Spartan austerity and honor masks a legal framework that allowed unmarried women to be reassigned to houses of civic service, inspected, renamed through administrative codes, and held under rules that stripped autonomy. This investigation reconstructs that scaffolding from archive fragments, from scratched inscriptions, and from the catalogs kept by clerks like Theron and the later notes of Euclea. The evidence is documentary and material. What follows will show decrees, ritual orders, and testimonies that make the pattern clear and harder to dismiss. To understand what happened, we need terms with sharp edges. Civic dedication was a legal status that converted a person into an obligation owed to the state. Purification was both a right and a pretext for inspection. Renaming replaced family names with classification titles that signaled administrative ownership. Initiation could mean assimilation into civic service or erasure of previous ties. The elders operated through lists recorded on pottery shards, wax tablets written by scribes, and sealed decrees that moved women between households and civic service houses. There were economic mechanics too. Debts and civic tributes functioned as currency for women deemed available for dedication. A father like Nicandros might offer his daughter to settle arrears, and in return receive a notation in the official ledger that transferred her to state custody. The council used these instruments to manage population, enforce obedience, and extract labor while maintaining a narrative of civic necessity and purity. Archives in the town hall, the private notes of Theron, and marginalia in administrative ledgers provide multiple matching traces of the same procedures. When Helena left her house, she passed 3 neighbors who avoided their eyes. Myrrhine spat in the dust as she walked by. The journey to the civic service house was ordinary to those who administered it and catastrophic to those who carried it. The path smelled of smoke from hearths, of sweat, and of wet wool. Guards walked with the cadence of routine. The door of the building was cool stone against the palm. The threshold carved with marks of previous dedications. Inside there was linen stacked by the wall, the metallic perfume of civic oils used in purification rites, and the constant low murmur of women who had learned silence. The first night she was given a cup of bitter barley and a thin cloak. A supervisor named Damaris checked her mouth for sores and recorded her response on an ostracon. The sound of the stylus on clay was a steady metronome that marked days. Helena tried to remember the names she had been called as a child and found them hollowed out by different voices that now addressed her as Helena the Dedicated. Helena had been born on a hill farm to Nicandros and Callistrate in a year of bad harvests. Her brother had been called to serve in the border patrol, and her father had taken loans against the meager yields. There were jars left as collateral and a small bronze bowl made by a cousin. When the tax collectors came that winter, they accepted 2 measures of barley, but required more. Nicandros signed papers that bound his household to future obligations without quite reading the clauses that allowed civic dedication in lieu of payment. He believed he traded a year, perhaps 2, for relief. He did not expect the clause that turned his daughter into a registered dependent of the state. Helena learned to weave by the hearth. She had been engaged once, though the agreement fell apart when her suitor was killed in a raid. That loss made her more vulnerable to the council, who argued that unmarried women of working age were proper candidates for consecration. The family name was written again in a ledger that meant someone else would decide Helena's body, her labor, and her rights. Around the time the documentation begins to thicken, several people appear in the files and in memory. Lysias is the elder who signed decrees of civic dedication. Theron is the clerk who wrote the ledgers and later hid marginal notes. Damaris is the supervisor who managed purification rites. Ariston is the official who used the service house's labor for civic festivals. Myrrhine and Callistrate appear as neighbors and witnesses. Euclia, the archivist, catalogued and later found discrepancies. Together, their names trace a network that made the system legible. A brief pause for you. If this shocks you, you are not alone. The reaction most feel is disbelief, then anger, then sorrow. If you want to help map how widespread these practices were, tell us with one word in the comments below. Write injustice if the economic logic outrages you. Write silence if the way communities hid it feels worst. Write memory if you think names should be restored. Start your comment with "I remember" and one detail if you can. Your words help shape future investigations and help historians prioritize archives. Now we return to the records. The capture of Helena's autonomy was procedural and bureaucratic. In a ledger entry dated to the month after the harvest, a short notation appears: dead, Helena of Nicandros. It was followed by an order to transfer her to the service house for initiation. The transport was recorded in a separate list as a movement of persons assigned to maintenance duties at civic shrines and to loom work for festivals. The process involved an inventory of her clothing and a sworn note by 2 witnesses that she was fit for service. The guards who escorted her signed with marks. Their size are not recorded, but their footsteps were square, measured, and loud in the empty streets. On arrival, the inspection began. Damaris commanded the bathhouse, called for oil scented with balsam and thyme, and arranged for a purification rite that bore both ritual language and administrative intent. She checked for tattoos, for signs that Helena belonged to another household, and for any mark that would complicate the claim of dedication. The inspection smelled of cedarwood, of hot wet stone, of the cold tang of metal hooks used to hold the tablet open, and of the barley and ash used to mark days. It was the moment the legal language touched a human body. The rituals that erased identity had a structure that looked ceremonial but functioned as repartition. First came purification baths declared necessary to cleanse the candidate for service. The water was heated, herbs were crushed under a pestle, smoke drifted in the small chamber, and the echoes of hymn fragments used in civic rites bounced off the walls. Damaris intoned formulaic words that sounded like prayer and like inventory. She said these things aloud while Theron recorded a clause. The second step was renaming. The elder Lysias spoke names in a voice that carried authority. He said, "You are no longer Helena, daughter of Nicandros. You are Helena, dedicated to the civic house." That renaming severed legal ties. The third step was an oath in which the woman pledged to maintain silence and service. The oath document was a small clay tablet sealed and archived. The final act was what officials called consecration, which in practice organized labor allocation and regulated marriage eligibility. In the space between the words sacred and service, the law added constraints that made departure extremely difficult. A ritual scene that became a courtroom of sorts followed strict dialogue and recorded lines. Helena stood with Damaris and Lysias and Theron, and Ariston listened from the side. Lysias said, "Helena, you have been dedicated." Helena replied, "I was not told this would be forever." Damaris said, "Tradition demands purity and obedience." Helena asked, "Who decides my work in my name?" Theron said, "The ledger decides and the elders enforce it." Ariston said, "Your labor will feed processions and fortify the city." Helena said, "What of my family and my child if I have one?" Damaris said, "Children born under dedication will be registered as civic dependents." Helena said, "This is servitude under the cloak of piety." Lysias said, "Servitude is a tool of order and survival." Theron said, "The records are clear and public." Euclia wrote, "Nothing allowed," but later noted discrepancies in the margin. The exchange was short and formal, and filled with the metallic sound of stylus on clay and the weight of sealed tablets. Life in the service house settled into controlled rhythms. Morning inspections called for parading before supervisors. Afternoons filled with weaving that smelled of damp wool and oil. Evenings for cleaning the shrine and chanting measured verses that dulled memory. The five senses registered the constraint at all moments. Sight was narrow corridors and curtained windows. Sound was the pounding of looms and the whispered lists of names. Smell was smoke, oil, and sour bread. Touch was the rough weave of work tunics and the cold metal of locks on storerooms. Taste was thin barley gruel. Punishments were quiet and institutional. Withheld rations, extra hours of labor, public listing on a board as remiss. The archive shows repeated notations of penalties for speech, for leaving assigned tasks, and for disobedience. Women, like Callistrate, who protested, received the label insubordinate and were reassigned to harsher duties. The chronicling of these moves in the ledgers made them less visible as abuse and more like administrative corrections. Union ceremonies were the most ambiguous and the most consequential. Officials framed them as sacred matches between the civic house and the city, a symbolic marriage that bound women to communal service. In practice, these unions granted certain elders or donors certain rights to labor and to the naming of children. Testimonies uncovered later in marginal letters describe how certain officials would claim priority in assigning duties and in reassigning children born under civic dedication to households aligned with political interests. The legal consequence was severe. Children might be recorded as dependents of the civic house, with no rights to claim family lineage. A woman's status determined her child's fate on paper. Reports from a traveling chronicler recorded hushed conversations about girls who became tools of alliance and trade, rather than partners in family life. The recorded rituals used language of honor and consecration, while the outcomes included economic exploitation and permanent separation from natal kin. Resistance existed in small, quiet acts and in rare confrontations. Helena learned to carve her name inside a hidden beam and to pass notes folded into hems. Marine smuggled bread once and was publicly admonished. Theron, the clerk, hid marginalia that later Euclea would discover, notes that suggested dates had been changed and promises unfulfilled. The files show 3 moments of sharp conflict and reprisal that made the cost of defiance visible. One instance involved a woman who refused to take the oath and was publicly displayed on the open square for a day. Another involved a group who sabotaged looms and were reassigned to extractive labor at the quarry. The third was a whispered attempt to bring the matter before an external magistrate that ended with threats and a new Anna. Regulation tightening the civic house's control. Each act of resistance led to administrative punishments designed both to discipline and to frighten others into compliance. The day the woman refused the oath, the square filled with faces, and the sun poured hot on the stones. Voices rose and then stilled. Guards pointed, and an elder read the sentence aloud with a voice that sounded like a bell. The woman stood calm and silent. She did not beg. The crowd watched as the council used show to teach obedience. After the humiliation, the record shows a notation that the woman's family was fined and her status recorded as corrective service. The ledger's brief lines turned shame into an accounting entry and turned protest into a quiet ledger footnote. When looms were sabotaged, the civic house's supply chain faltered, and festivals teetered on the edge of embarrassment. The elders interpreted the act as treason against civic ritual and called for exemplary reassignment. The reassigned worked long days in the quarry, where the air smelled of dust and iron. A note from Theron in a hidden margin, found later by Euclea, hints at sympathy and at fear. He wrote that the penalties were meant to teach the others that the cost of collective action would outweigh any temporary gain. A petition brought to a magistrate by a small group was answered with a decree strengthening the civic house's legal powers. The petitioners disappeared from public lists, and the magistrate's minutes show only a brief discussion that ends with the word "settled." Later notes suggest threats and bribes shaped the outcome. The climactic impression is that legal institutions could be used to legitimize silence. Records change hands, and names are erased through process rather than force. The documentary traces do not stop with routine cruelty. There are later echoes. One of Theron's marginal notes detailed an order to reassign certain women to Ariston's festival crews in return for grain shipments. Another fragment from Euclea lists discrepancies in dates that suggest some dedications were extended by clerical decree. Archaeologists found pottery shards with scratched lists of names that matched ledgers. An ostracon shows the phrase "dedicated" crossed out and rewritten with a different year. Such material corroborates what the ledgers and the occasional traveler's diary imply. The system was durable and adaptable. A small victory came when local amateurs and an archivist named Euclea recatalogued the town records. 1 month after the first public release of the ledgers, volunteers had found additional entries and published a corrective list. 3 months later, an academic from the city university wrote a critique that forced a review of the cataloging methods used by the magistracy. 6 months after that, a modest exhibition displayed objects and the names that had been recovered. The exhibition did not undo decades of constraint, but it allowed certain voices to be restored on paper. Families like that of Nicandros received acknowledgement in a local pamphlet, and Helena's hidden carving was copied and shown in public. The slow steps brought attention, but no single grand reckoning. The elders kept much of their authority, but lost the simple convenience of anonymous ledger entries. When Helena died years later, she was not famous. Her burial is modest and unrecorded in public ritual directories. Still, fragments remained. A carved beam, a smudged ostracon, and the margin where Theron had once hesitated to write a date together formed a trace that resisted erasure. The evidence we have is a mosaic made of small broken pieces. It shows that institutions can convert promises of purity and civic necessity into mechanisms of control. It shows that legal language and ritual can make servitude appear honorable. If this account resonates and you want more documented investigations into how social orders used ritual to justify coercion, subscribe. Share this with someone who studies institutions or community memory. Leave a comment with one word, and a memory if you have one, and help guide the next inquiry. Remember the names that survive in fragments. Remember the carved beam that said, "I existed." The stones remember. We must now.